Good evening. Welcome to the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory. Tonight I ask the question, do what to save Christmas? Firstly, I want to apologize for the reduced volume of broadcasting at this present moment. Given the situation that's unfolding globally and the kind of rising authoritarianism, the kind of medical tyranny or vaxism, if you will, whereby we're seeing society divided, separated based upon their medical status, people being discriminated against for their personal choices. I find myself increasingly investing my time in understanding how we can tackle this particular emerging ideology and trying to make sense of the undercurrents that underpin the very situation that we find ourselves in, having some fascinating conversations with everything from the scientific community to politicians, to psychologists, to business leaders, to activists, to really understand how we can begin to tackle this situation and begin to turn the tide. And it's no easy feat. But there's lots of sense making going on, some fascinating joining of the dots on a localized basis and a national basis, but also some relationships now being built on a global basis as we recognize the global magnitude of the situation we're facing and the need for global collaboration in order to shift the trajectory of the situation that we find ourselves in. But the title of this broadcast is Do What to Save Christmas? And of course, this relates to the latest newspaper headlines, which is all about booster jabs to save Christmas. Of course, now the JCVI very rapidly approved, as expected, the booster jabs for 18 and above, having previously been reserved for a select high-risk categories. Now the idea is that Britain is going to offer the jab. Offer. I mean, next time I broadcast, I'll come prepared with the definition of offer. And compare it to the approach that's taken by the government. That would be a little whimsical laugh for us to take that in the context of its actual meaning. But the idea is that the all over 18s will be offered the jab rapidly at record pace in order to save Christmas. So cue propaganda for the kind of bait and switch of carrot and stick of your Christmas is under threat and it's your moral duty to get vaccinated. It's your you need to snitch on your neighbors and your friends if you catch them not being vaccinated, hiding under the floorboards to avoid the COVID tyranny. But quite clearly, as always, the threat of this propaganda is effective. Couple that with bringing in the army once again to administer this, the logistics of such an operation. All the while, this is a classic political ploy, which in many ways is a knee-jerk reaction of being seen to do something in the face of a changing environment. Now, what's clear already, and it's kind of like a hold your horses moment. There's many issues surrounding the booster, the shots 1 and 2 of the various different vaccines, whether Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, Johnson and Johnson, and the various others out there. There's lots of question marks over efficacy, safety, let alone the booster shots, and really making sense of this is quite a challenge. I spent some time yesterday, in the interest of tackling my own bias, really, and making sure that I'm not just pursuing a path of confirmation bias. Spent some time looking at the potential for the jab's impact on hospitalization and death, and it's just a minefield. It's a minefield to get the actual data that you need to make a sound evaluation if you were to compare and contrast. But then, trying to then overlay adverse reactions and potential deaths attributed to the vaccine or associated with the vaccine within a temporal period, and overlaying the kind of all-cause mortality, where often the real story is told about what's really happening. But I found it incredibly difficult, and that's a piece of work that's ongoing. But I'm trying to make sense of, have these things actually made a positive impact? And it's difficult to assess in a holistic way. You may be able to make some deductions on specifically on the isolated variable of just COVID hospitalizations and deaths. But when you start to look at the wider health problems that have started to emerge and the all-cause mortality, there's a blurry picture that needs unfolding. So all of this is happening whilst we're rushing to launch the kind of booster jab. on the understanding that we're doing this because jab 1 and 2 does not deliver adequate, sustainable immune defense against the incumbent variant Delta and potentially the new variant, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it's a tacit admission that the protocols to date have not been effective enough in the fact that they wane, and therefore there requires this third jab. And then, of course, on top of that, you've now got the EU saying that there'll be a 9-month expiry date, a unilateral 9-month expiry date on any particular jab. So that means booster 3, if you get it on the 1st of December, you've got 9 months. You've got until August next year before you need your next booster shot, a maximum of 9 months. And believe me, there'll be another variant in that time. There'll be another scare that will bring forward the next dose, quite evidently. And this is a quite fascinating time to witness a business model emerging out of a crisis in this way. Yet so many people not paying attention to the wedge of profit being extracted from a crisis under the idea of you protecting your safety. But I do want to further my analysis of the impact of the vaccinations, because I don't want to fall into a confirmation trap. I do want to remain a sense of balance. And what I would actually like to do, I can make sense of numbers, I can ask questions, and I can lean on other experts. And I've got the privilege now of being connected to all kinds of medical scientific expertise and statistician through this work, through the Pandemic Podcast. But I would love to get the kind of what the quote unquote opposing forces together. There's some abundantly pro-vaccine individuals who quite simply seem to refuse to acknowledge that it comes with any potential risks and that the benefits outweigh the risks in every possible way. There's this ideological idea that all vaccines are generally safe and effective without any quantification around that. It's just a belief system that is held. Whereas on the other side, you've also got the other side that kind of argue that there's no benefit, but we want to kind of look at the two polar opposite ends and try and find where the reality is by taking a look at this. But I say this in the context of this idea of saving Christmas, because first and foremost, we should be firstly looking at the underlying risk factors that warrant intervention. And what then is the most appropriate intervention for that underlying risk. So firstly, then let's take the incumbent variant Delta, based upon what we now know on the risk factors in terms of severity of illness, severity of symptoms, the level of hospitalization and the categories of people who are hospitalized, because we have rich data sets, not publicly available, of course, but there are rich data sets available on the particular risk profiles within each variant that we've seen. There's never been such an obsession with collecting information and studying this particular virus. So you would have thought 2 years on, we have a very clear, you would have thought 2 years on, we'd have a crystal clear idea of, which cohorts within society are most at risk of COVID-19, at least when that comes to experiencing severe symptoms or worse mortality. And the reality is we do have that information. And what we should be looking at is how do we mitigate that risk? What is the most effective way to mitigate that risk? Because when we look at the Pfizer trial data for 12 to 15-year-olds, and again, there's very questionable practices around the Pfizer trials. There seems to be this inherent trust in pharmaceuticals and inherent trust in government, which I think is a product of the fact that we've been so heavily bombarded with behavioral manipulation and fear-mongering that people have lost the ability to trust in themselves. They've lost the ability to trust in their own judgment. They can't make sense of the world they're around. So they're left with, simply believing what they see in the media and believing what they see in the government. And when you ask people, do you trust the government about their response to COVID-19? They often say yes, but then you ask them, do you trust them in other ways? Oh, hell no. You ask a classic Labour supporter if they trust the Conservatives, and it's almost a categoric no. But somehow, for some reason, they trust them in the COVID response. It's just insane. It's just the cognitive dissonance is insane. There's this blanket trust in authority. It's a classic pattern in the face of crisis and fear. Is the deference to authority. There's been tons of psychological studies done on this. It's a classic human behavior. Human behavior, of course, is the human condition is the ultimate problem that we're facing here, which is manifesting all these different ways. But the Pfizer study, without going into depth into the flaws of the trial, showed that within 12 to 15-year-olds, there was only a 3% reduction in cases. And in either way, the endpoint of which I think is a flawed metric, because we've already witnessed that the level of reduction of infectiveness is highly debatable. But the endpoint of severe illness and death, there was no different. There was no distinction between the unvaccinated and the vaccinated within the Pfizer trial. No difference whatsoever. So it's you take that, but you also then have to look at the children's the impact upon children. For instance, if we're going to take a look at children and risk factors, how many children that have contracted COVID have had severe symptoms? How many have been hospitalized? How many have died? It's a negligible number comparatively, particularly when you look at the older population, and it poses an almost infinite, an infinitely small risk. Of course, there's always some risk, but you can't mitigate against every risk. If you try and mitigate against every risk, we just may as well say that we no longer live, we simply exist. You can mitigate the risk of road traffic accidents by taking all the cars off the road. You can mitigate the overall risk of domestic violence by putting CCTV in every household, or even banning relationships altogether. If you want to take it to the nth degree of extreme cultural safetyism, which is what we're witnessing here. But my point here is that when we're looking at a mass vaccination campaign, we should be first looking at who are the risk categories and how do we take a targeted intervention, firstly, and what is the most appropriate intervention in order to protect the particular groups that are at risk, which includes early treatments. There's a whole range of doctors and scientists around the world right now arguing that early treatments could, for the bulk of cases amongst the lesser risk category populations, offer sufficient protection against severe disease. Yet this is it's completely ignored. And in fact, it's suppressed and censored and cancelled, which again goes back to the cha-ching money bag argument around the insane level of profiteering that is coming from this pandemic. But the public just willingly accept this idea, firstly, that we have to, everyone kind of was like, okay, we vaccinate the most vulnerable, protect those categories that are at risk. But then it just starts creeping down the scale to now in Europe have just approved 5 to 12-year-olds, the rollout for 5 to 12-year-olds. And it's going to go all the way to 6 months plus. Pfizer are pushing for this. There's an insane amount of money and political lobbying. We know it's going to go all the way to 6 months plus. And once it hits 6 months, where that's going to go. Look at the volume of childhood vaccinations that these babies, and I know all about it. I've got a 12-week-year-old, and I'm getting bombarded with all kinds of propaganda about the levels of medical intervention that I should be exposing my child to at just 12 weeks old, including, diseases and infections that he's just not going to come into contact with in his junior life. So we know that it will go all the way. It's going to go. It won't stop at 6 months. Let's be honest. But that's where it's heading. But there's just no acceptance of understanding underlying risk and therefore determining the most effective possible intervention, let alone then looking at the safety record and the efficacy and the overall actual risk reduction versus relative risk reduction. It's not even considered. So the JCVI have now approved the booster shots for over 18s, and of course the propaganda campaign about saving Christmas is now live. We're seeing this immense pressure to be vaccinated. Currently, 23% of the British population are considered fully vaccinated under the new terminology of 3 doses. Which, overnight, those people who felt that they'd done their part, they'd done their duty, they'd always communicate. The government almost communicates like we're in this warlike situation where it's your duty to protect your nation, to protect each other. But the argument that the vaccines protect each other is it's a much of a futile one on the basis that we know it doesn't significantly reduce infection or transmission. You could argue that actually if there was an effective vaccination, that if by reducing hospitalizations, you are protecting the healthcare system. That's a legitimate argument, potentially, but it's only as a standalone argument. When you then take that out at scale to, well, take, for example, this morning in the gym this morning, I was the only person in the gym, a big gym. I was the only person working out. So where was everyone else that was going to work out to protect me by getting fit and healthy? People aren't looking to protect others by protecting their own health and their own fitness, by taking personal responsibility for their own nutrition, their own workouts, their own lifestyle choices, because those are the things that actually bolster your immune system. Those are the things that actually lead to a healthy life. And actually, if you are talking about reducing the burden of hospitalizations, if you wanted to go really extreme, you could say, well, the elderly, they're a burden on the hospital system. If you're going to take that argument, smokers, alcoholics, those who are overweight or obese. But we're not going to start mandating and saying that they have to pay for their healthcare treatment over others. We're not going to say that we're going to discriminate against them. And that would be so much. Imagine the outcry if you suddenly said we're going to exclude these people from hospital treatment because their own choices has led to adverse health instances. But that's the same argument you're making for the kind of idea that vaccines are getting vaccinated is a duty in order to protect the healthcare system. It's the same argument, but people won't follow that train. In fact, I think in the prospect of mandatory vaccinations right now, I think there would be more of an uproar if governments mandated 5 fruits and vegetables a day. I think you would see much more dissent if people had to take personal responsibility and actually eat healthy. That's the reality of the situation. So we've got the situation where now, almost overnight, because there's a new scariant, the mindset of the populace, and you watch the government communication and the propaganda come. We're going to do a lot of kind of calling out the game stuff moving forward on the podcast. I'm working with a lot of behavioral scientists, psychologists. The interview we did with Matthias Desmet was one of the first of this kind of calling out the game series that we're going to do. We'll start to dissect the communication just to show how people are being manipulated and how they're being coerced for compliance. We're going to call it out directly, almost like an anti-propaganda league, in terms of calling out the game. But almost overnight now, people have got into the mindset that it's necessary for them to get this booster in order to protect themselves and others. It's instant. Having previously, thought they'd done their bit by getting their double jab, now they're in they're part of the great unwashed because they've only had 2 jabs. It's partly it is going to pierce the veil of the cognitive dissonance, but it's going to take a bit of effort to go all the way. But it's a start. But you watch the propaganda in the coming weeks. The threat of taking away Christmas in Greece now, they're fining over 60s 100 euros a month equivalent for if they're unvaccinated. So there's a monthly fee to be an unvaccinated citizen, which is ludicrous. And we're seeing all kinds of coercive, forceful measures. Now, if it was genuinely out of compassion and care for one's citizens, do you think you would be using force and behavioral techniques to unconsciously persuade people to do things if you really cared about people? No, that's not how you operate. We're seeing the people unvaccinated being stigmatized, discriminated against, labeled. We're seeing fines levied, the threat of prison terms. Which country is going to be the first country to go all in on the tyranny? It's likely to, in my view, to be Australia or Canada or one of these particular countries. But it's just going to create a ripple effect. Now, let's talk about the new variant very briefly. So one of the very first things, having talked about the kind of logical fallacy of vaccinating the entire world, let's talk about the new variant. Now, one of the first things that came out as a reason to be afraid, remember, only a few days ago, one of the reasons why we need to be afraid as a nation or as a world, a population, is because of the mutations in the spike protein, which potentially puts at risk the vaccine efficacy against this new variant. So wouldn't you think, in light of that, you would take the extra step of doing some research, of doing some, following some scientific process to actually evaluate whether that is a real risk, rather than just making the assumption that's plowing more jabs into one's body is actually going to offer protection. Now, think of the level of money that's been spent on this booster rollout, not only in terms of the jab itself, but all the infrastructure that supports it, the supply chain. And now imagine in just a month's time, when we actually do, or a few weeks' time, we do have the data, that it has negligible effect or even a negative effect, because we are seeing negative inverse patterns where you see a sudden increase in cases or deaths following a mass vaccination rollout. We have seen that. So imagine you see this overall waning of immunity and actually it's a detractor. Just the extra step to actually go through the scientific process, rather than just the assumption that we just need more vaccines in order to tackle this thing. Given that was the key line, that we need to be afraid because these things might not work. So why are we upping the ante, particularly now if it is more transmissible and does become the new dominant strain? Let's say it surpasses Delta, as Delta surpassed Alpha before. I've said on this show before, this is how viruses work. There's likely to be another variant that surpasses the last one, and it will keep happening until eventually it becomes more transmissible, but the symptoms become negligible. And on that point, when everyone was panicking about this new most severe variant yet, they were talking about potential transmission rates based upon a very, 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 very tiny data set, and very little information on severity of symptoms. But it's materializing, like as with Delta. The majority of symptoms are seemingly more light, quote unquote, lightweight. They're not as severe. They're more cold-like. Which again would be a positive sign that one on the way out, and in fact, in which case, dare I say it, in this world where you can't speak common sense in Common Sense Corner over here, that herd immunity could actually provide a route out. And I've been saying this since the very beginning, but it's been politicized. If you think the Great Barrington Declaration was used as a scapegoat and eradicated the argument that natural immunity could even play a role. And case in point, get this. This is my favorite part of this broadcast coming up, 22 minutes in. Oh, dear, oh, dear. This part is just genuinely hilarious in the context of things. You have to smile and laugh at the situation, otherwise you'll go crazy. So in the UK, we have this. You have the SAGE group, which is the government advisory group. But then we have this independent SAGE group that is supposedly independent of the government and offering an unbiased point of view on the situation. Well, we know that there are an extreme left-wing radical organization that is comprised of several communists in their makeup. They are pro-lockdown, they are pro-mandate, they are pro-zero COVID. There's nothing independent about that organization. It's laughable. And actually, I do think there's some good people in that organization that have just got caught up. It's like in the playground when you accidentally, you for a period of time get caught in the wrong crowd for a while. You didn't even realize it was happening, and all of a sudden you're like, I don't want to be part of this gang. I'm not part of this group. Let me get out. How do I get out of this? It's like that. There are some good people in the independent SAGE group. I'm sure I've spoken to a couple of them. I had one on the show. I spoke to him offline for ages, and there was just like this light bulb moment going off when we were talking about some of the things that they hadn't even considered. But nonetheless, here's the funny point. Now 24 minutes in. Bear in mind the JCVI, the Joint Committee for Vaccines and Immunizations. The clues in the title, Joint Committee for Vaccines and Immunizations. They're relatively pro-vaccine. The clues in the title. Independent SAGE accused the JCVI of being anti-vax. Anti-vax, the JCVI anti-vax, for delaying and hesitating on the approval of childhood vaccinations on the basis that the JCVI had concluded that the risks may outweigh the benefits of vaccination, on the basis also in the context that the risks to children of COVID-19 are negligible. They are extremely low risk. They come with very little mortality, if any, that can be directly attributed to the virus, and in many cases are symptomless or mild at worst. So they concluded that it may be favorable to allow herd immunity, to allow the virus to rip through the population, which is the phrase that they use to just completely eradicate the idea that it's even possible to allow people to get sick. I have a human right, surely, to get sick. Surely I have the right to be healthy and the right to be sick. That is freedom. And my choice to get sick in this context is a choice to receive my immunity naturally, which I believe, according to the science, offers much more longer lasting and wider and broader and deeper immunity than the products that we're having jammed down our throats or into our arms. So the independent sage accused the JCVI of being anti-vax on the basis that they allow the virus to circulate amongst the children where there's very low risk. And those children, by the way, by virtue of getting the virus, would likely experience little to no symptoms, very short period of time, very unlikely to transmit amongst the community. But as a result, would start to build this layer of protection, which actually would bolster overall community immunity. Heaven forbid we do that. We can't allow that to happen naturally. Imagine the foregone profits. Imagine the money you're leaving on the table doing that. And it goes on to talk about long COVID, as always, long COVID. But there's the data around long COVID is exceptionally questionable. Some of the work that Professor Dr. Anthony Hinton has done on that is fascinating, where it actually shows that many of the background variables were already present. There's all kinds of worrying and questions around long COVID. Now, long COVID does exist. Technically, I'm suffering from long COVID. I had COVID back in July. And until recently, until about a week ago, I still couldn't smell or taste anything at all. Like over 3 months on. Now I'm in this bizarre, like semi-taste and smell zone where I can kind of like it seems like my taste and smell is returning by about 1% a week. This awful kind of metallic taste to everything. It's no matter what I eat, other than red hot chili peppers, everything tastes of this sickening, sweet, sickly, metallic flavor. But that is no reason to qualify that as long COVID. It's a normal post-viral recovery. It's like anything. Like people don't realize that colds can cause pneumonia in the elderly, because they've never done the research. And I'd never done the research on, post-viral syndromes, because you just don't. But it turns out that loss of taste and smell are very common post-viruses. And unfortunately, there's very little you can do about it. But there is some. This has kind of forced some experimentation on some of the things that may actually accelerate. If you're watching this and you found a cure to the taste and smell thing, please do let me know, because my baby is 12 weeks old, and I've missed the aroma of his nappies whilst I change his nappies, which has been a major benefit. But but I would like to be able to taste my food again. Abby says no one's ever isolated the original COVID. Well, that depends if you're looking at it from a terrain theory perspective, and that's a whole new episode in itself. We've got tons of papers on the isolation of the virus, but it's from a germ theory perspective, and many people, during this time, as always, during these types of time, there's a variance of ideologies around the scientific community. But I'll do an episode on that, because there's lots of things I can share on that. But nonetheless, if you've had the virus, you know that this thing is pretty unique. It lends itself to the discussion that this could be a lab created scenario, because for me, myself personally, my immune system didn't know what the heck it was doing. You could tell, that bizarrely there was no gland swelling or anything like that. Any mucus was clear. There was no like yellow. There's all kinds of peculiarities. And, having spoken to a lot of people now that have had it, these slightly bizarre immune responses, which are uncommon to, colds or flus. So I know there's a whole lot of discussion in that area, but my point is around long COVID. We can't conflate, your regular post-viral syndrome with COVID. It's just irrational to do that. And to lay that on the children as an excuse to vaccinate them is, quite frankly, just laughable. It's not laughable. it's laudable. It's just inconceivable. But this is the nature of the world right now. We don't care about risk. We don't care about the underlying risk. We just care about getting as many needles and arms as possible, and to maximize the profit and the opportunity. And my cryptocurrency, my initial foray into crypto is It's led to some minor losses. But if I'd put that money into pharma, I'm sure I'd see some big gains. But there's no morals in doing that. There's no ethics in supporting corrupt companies. I couldn't ever bring myself to profit from a bad situation like that. But this is the behavior. Goes back to the human condition that is underpinning all of this. Greed, the centralization of power, money, and control is underpinning all of what we're witnessing right now. That's the number one thing that we're seeing. So I ended up talking about a lot more than I planned to tonight. This is going to be a 15-minute episode, but double that. Classic. So what are we going to do to save Christmas? Make your own choices. I did a survey on Twitter. If you're not following me on Twitter, that's where I do most of my ranting in short form character format. But you can just find Dan J. Gregory on Twitter in my old unmarried name. But I did a poll and I asked, who will determine how you spend your Christmas this year? You or the government? And 99% said that they will. But it's all very well saying that. Actually having the courage to be non-compliant is what it's going to take here if there is any threat of the government. And the third option is, of course, the family, because if your family don't see the world the same as you, then of course your family may determine how you spend Christmas. That's the third variable in the mix, which comes back to the overall point I started this broadcast on, is trying to make sense of how we progress from this situation and alter the trajectory. Ultimately, it comes down to communication and influence at scale, influencing the public, influencing the media, influencing the legal sector, influencing government, influencing business, influencing education, influencing organized religion. There's a lot of work ahead, ladies and gents, which is why what we need to do to prepare ourselves for the future is to firstly understand the methods of propaganda, the methods of communication and influence that is being used in order to generate compliance amongst ourselves so that we become immune to that type of propaganda. But then secondly, we need to start creating our own narrative, our own story about how this is going to unfold, and begin to support each other in the creation of alternative solutions to the situation we find ourselves in. Because ultimately, when there's a superior solution to most of these things, that's where we can start to make real traction. But the deeper you investigate the kind of currents that underpin what we're seeing right now, kind of along the political, cultural, social, economic, and legal, and scientific, technological kind of areas, you recognize that this isn't going to go away anytime fast, and it's going to spill over into many other areas of our life. We're already seeing it within the climate and the economy. The economy is going to reveal, the changes in the economy are going to show themselves in the next 12 months. There's many more difficulties and challenges ahead based upon the undercurrent that's actually driving all of this. So we do need to buckle up for the ride, but do so with a smile. Take care of our mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being throughout this, and start to gather the tribes, start to build a resistance to accelerate which will accelerate the path to the kind of authoritarian self-demise, because authoritarianism regimes do become self-defeating. And the more we unite and gather resistance, which is part of the work that I've been doing in the background, the faster we can get this thing to pass. But nonetheless, we do need to be creating the think tanks, the organizations, the initiatives, and using our own creativity and imagination to start to forge the world that we want to see. Because as I said, there's an undercurrent that is driving all of this. What we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. And really, in order to tackle that, we can spend our time partly resisting and challenging what's coming at us, but more importantly, starting to build alternatives for the future, which is where the most exciting opportunities lie. So it begins really with the self. Despite this kind of war on individualism, the war on individual rights, it does begin at home. It does begin with how we live our own lives. It does begin with how we show up in our own selves and how we live our own values, how we raise our own consciousness, and how we create a ripple effect in the world as a result of that. But then how we use that energy, that loving, peaceful energy, that kind of humanity within us to imagine the future. That's how we start to really move things forward. That's how we start to shift the pendulum. That's how we start to change the trajectory and alter the narrative going forward. But it must be done from that place of true heart and compassion and higher consciousness. Otherwise, it's just another It's just another boomerang into the world where we bring more anger, more frustration, and we build that kind of scarcity and trauma in what we're doing. So it comes back to coming back to conscious awareness, that place of stillness, that power of now, and starting to imagine the future that we can create, because that's ultimately what's going to shift all of this. We can fight the narrative and the mandates in the first instance. It's important that we do that and tackle that, because ultimately the government serve the people. And when the people speak out in sufficient volumes, things will begin to change. But that doesn't change the undercurrent. It doesn't change the tide. It's down to us to change the tide. So on that note, I'll say good night to you. I always think in these situations, we've got to look ourselves in the mirror and determine what role we're going to play in transforming the future. And that's my invite to you tonight, is to journal on that question. What can you do in order to lead change in the world around you, whether that's on your local community, in your own family life, or broader within the world of politics that we're facing right now, or the world of innovation or creativity that can spawn new solutions to the world's problems. Determine what role you can play in changing the world around you, because I believe each one of us has the power to create significant change in the world. And together, when we operate, when we unite against this kind of common tyranny and authoritarianism with the right energy, then we will succeed. So on that note, I'll say good night. Please do subscribe to the Pandemic Podcast. We're doing an awful lot of work in the background right now to not only help try and influence the situation that we find ourselves in, but we are about to launch a community program to build an empowered community, an elevated community of higher conscious leaders to help try and play a part in creating a positive catalyst of change in the world. So do subscribe to the newsletter to be the first to hear about that. That's danjgregory.com/pandemic. And you'll hear about what our plans are very soon. But tune in. We'll be back again tomorrow. I'm going to be talking about the latest World Health Organization international treaty developments. That's a shocking piece of news. And then on Thursday, I have a very special guest. So watch this space for Thursday night, where we'll be talking about some of the action being taken to stand against the medical mandates that are unfolding in the UK. So watch this space. Lots of exciting content coming up. Peace out for now. Do not comply. And I'll see you on our next